we're going to continue today with the discussion of the chapter of the human condition on action. We started it last week. Just to remind ourselves, action is one of the three faculties of the vita activa, the active life that for Arendt are part of the human condition, not human nature. To the extent that there's a hierarchy, and we've talked a little bit about the fact that it's not a hard hierarchy, action is for Arendt the highest. You can get other people to labor for you. You can even get other people to work or do art for you. But if you're going to be human for Arendt, you have to act. Action, she says, is in the most general sense, this we talked about last week, means to take an initiative, to begin, to start something new. It's thus a kind of freedom. And so she will write in another one of her essays that to act and to be free are the same. In acting and being free and starting something new, one appears in the world. And thus action is not only about freedom, it's about appearance. And one of the really unique aspects of Arendt's thinking is her focus on appearance. She says that all things that live want to appear in the world. And thinking through the importance of appearance is very important in our reading of Arendt. And in today's discussion, the second section we're reading is going to be on the space of appearances. And so we'll have a chance to do that. So I hope that reminds us a little bit of where we're at. We ended at the end of the last session with section 26 called The Frailty of Human Affairs. And in The Frailty of Human Affairs, we run into two problems with human action. One is that it's boundless, which means that once you start an action, it can bring about new relationships and new experiences in the world that cannot be, in a sense, controlled and limited. And thus, if you want to create a stable political realm, that's difficult. And the second is that it's unpredictable. You simply can't predict where action is going to go or what an action will lead to, which means that any action you do could lead to evil as well as good, which means that, should we act? And at the very end of the section on action, the chapter on action, in the sections on forgiveness and promising, Arendt will argue that in the end, forgiveness and promising are the two human capacities that make action and political action especially possible. But we're not there yet. And before we get there, she reflects on these two frailties of action, namely that they are boundless and unpredictable. And she says the Greeks had a solution to the frailties of action. On the one hand, there's the solution of Achilles, which is that you let yourself die early, and in letting yourself die early, end your action in a way that you can control it, and at least to a certain degree control it. And yet, even for Achilles, his action and the story of his action is only really controlled by Homer, the poet, not by Achilles. There's another solution that the Greeks had, which was the philosophical solution of Plato and Aristotle, which is to subordinate the risky and uncertain, boundless and unpredictable nature of action to philosophy and truth, legislation, and thus to imagine a legislator, a lawgiver, in Plato's case, a philosopher king, who would come and say, here is the truth, here is how we should act, and subordinate the action of politics to a kind of making, praxis to poesis in the Greek word. The third Greek solution, and the one that Arendt thinks is the most interesting, is the discovery and the development of the Greek polis, the Greek city-state. And what the polis did is brought people together into a political entity, a polis. I think I've used this example before, but polis from politeia, all the words in Greek, politeia, politike, polis, originate from the Greek word plenein, the verb, which is the verb describing the upward round movements of smoke rings in a circle. And Arendt will ask, what is the relationship between these circular rings and politics? And the answer is, for her, that what politics is the gathering of a group of plural and unequal people around a common center. And the polis is that common center that emerges whenever a group of people gather together. And the reason the polis is a solution to the problem of unpredictability and boundlessness is that the polis, by bringing people together around a common center, allows them to act with the assurance, or at least the expectation, that their acts will be seen and taken note of by others, and that first, and this is on page 197, that first, about 6 lines down, the polis was supposed to multiply the occasions to win immortal fame. Right? So the first way that the polis solves this problem is that it makes it possible for you to become famous. And in making it possible for you to become famous, it takes away this idea of the boundlessness of action, the idea that your act will lead to so many different things, but it will, in a sense, lose itself in its boundlessness. People will take note, and you will be noticed. And the second, a little bit further down that paragraph, she says the second function of the polis was to offer a remedy for the futility of action and speech, for the chances that a deed deserving fame would not be forgotten. So if the first is that it gives you immortal fame, here it's simply that it prevents you from being forgotten. And in preventing you from being forgotten, the polis makes action worthwhile. Even though action might lead to evil, even though action might lead to insecurity and danger, action promises you memory and potentially fame, and thus makes action worthwhile. And that's, as she understands it, the Greek solution to the problem of futility of action. One thing just to note is to take a look at the very last paragraph of section 27. This space of the polis, right, that is the solution to the futility of action, she says, doesn't always exist. This is on page 199. It can't exist, and nobody could live in the polis all the time. No man, she says, can live in the polis all the time. To be deprived of the polis means to be deprived of reality, which humanly and politically speaking is the same as appearance. So you need the polis or you lose reality. To men, the reality of the world is guaranteed by the presence of others. But you can't be in the polis all the time. And that's why you need the private sphere. You need a place to hide, something we've talked a lot about throughout these sessions. Okay, so let's move on to section 28, which is on power and the space of appearance. This is probably the richest of the chapters that we're reading today. Also the longest. The topic here are two: power and the space of appearance. And her point is that power and the space of appearance go together. You can't really have one without the other. Power is a potential. It's never actual. But I mean, it can be actualized at a moment, but it can always disappear. It's not something that can, in a sense, be preserved. Why do we need power? Why do we need political power? Because if you don't have political power, If you don't, and what is political power? It is the coming together of a group of people around a common center, politics, and them engaging in that politics, in that public world. If you don't do that, the political world has no legitimacy, has no authority over you, and it seems illegitimate. And the result of that is you don't take its commands seriously, and you don't engage in it. And thus politics loses legitimacy, which can either lead to a revolution or simply, and more likely from Arendt's perspective, a long and uncomfortable feeling of illegitimate political power with no solution. It's quite rare, she says, to live in an illegitimate solution where power has, in a sense, ceased to be actualized. It's quite common to do that. It's quite rare for someone to actually come around and pick up the power that has been, in a sense, lost and create a new revolutionary government that is seen as legitimate. What these reflections mean for Arendt, and this is unique in her writing, I think, quite unique, is that for Hannah Arendt, we need to create a political system that creates power and that keeps the opportunities for power and the creation of power alive on a regular basis. The problem we have is that we live at a time in which we distrust power. I mean, there is no more, there's no more taken for granted truism, I think, in our political world than power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And Arendt understands that. But what she's saying here, and she develops this at a much greater length in her book on revolution, but what she's saying here is that in order for you to have legitimate political authority, you need power, because power is about when people come together in this space of appearance and act and speak together. And just to use the example she offers in On Revolution, the United States, she says, was the true innovation of the American governmental system was its incredible decentralization and federalist model, in which on a local, state, county, and federal level, through the courts, the legislatures, and the executives, through both governmental and also non-governmental NGOs and civic organizations, the United States, more than any other country in history, created multiple power sources in its government and allowed them to coexist through its Federalist Constitution. And that was, for Arendt, the great innovation and the great success, at least for a certain period, of the United States government. So for Arendt, the space of appearances is where a group of different individuals come together and appear in public. And in doing so, they form a polis and they can act. And their actions can be noticed and thus remembered. The most disturbing and yet important passage in this chapter is on page 205, and we should just take a quick look at it. She's discussing Pericles' great funeral oration. And in it, about 4 or 5 lines down on that bottom paragraph on 205, she says, unlike human behavior, which the Greeks, like all civilized people, judged according to moral standards, taking into account motives and intentions on the one hand and aims and consequences on the other. So behavior, when you act according to rules of behavior, that's moral. And we have standards of, was that good behavior or bad behavior? But unlike behavior, action, now remember what action is. It's new, it's an initiative, it's spontaneous, it's something unexpected, that's non-behavioral, it doesn't follow rules. Thus, it can't be judged by moral rules. Thus, unlike human behavior, action can be judged not by moral rules, but only by the criterion of greatness, because it is in its nature to break through the commonly accepted and reach into the extraordinary, where whatever is true in common and everyday life no longer applies because everything that exists is unique and sui generis. The point of action for Arendt is that because it's always new and always spontaneous and always unexpected, it can't be judged by any existing standards, moral, behavioral, or otherwise. It's extraordinary. And thus, she can continue a couple lines down. The art of politics teaches men how to bring forth what is great and radiant, ta megala kai lampra, the great which shines forth, in the words of Democritus. As long as the polis is there to inspire men to dare the extraordinary. The polis, that which gathers us into a space of appearances, allows political action in which we dare the extraordinary, and in daring the extraordinary, act such that people will take note of our action, and in taking note of our action, they will judge it. Well, how do they judge it? Was it great or not? Now, they can also judge it great, yet awful, terrible, criminal. But if they judge it criminal, they will punish or expel you. But if they judge it great, that action will have brought something new into the world, brought a new idea, a new thought, a new way of being, a new government potentially into the world. And that is only possible when we have a space of appearance where we can act on the confidence that our actions will be seen and remembered. So the next two sections that we read for today are okay, asking the question of, okay, we need this space of appearance. We need this idea of power where people come together and act. We need, therefore, to create memory and remembrance. And action, as we know, is boundless and futile. And so we need to create this place where we will be remembered. And she writes on page 208 at the top of the first full paragraph, the conviction that the greatest that man can achieve is his own appearance and actualization is by no means a matter of course. That's, of course, a bit ironic here. Of course, right? So she's saying that understood politically and through action, the greatest achievement of man is to appear and act in such a way that he or she will be remembered. And she says, most people don't agree with that. And now we're going to talk about two disagreements with that, which are dominant in the modern era and which represent the other two faculties of the human condition and the vita activa, namely work and labor. So on the one hand, homo faber, the fabricating man, the working man, needs a public space, because when the homo faber creates something, whether it's a pen or a chair or a painting, he has to sell it or give it to others. He has to show it to other people. And so the homo faber needs a public space, a common space, a space of appearance. But, and here's the distinction, whereas in action, the actor and his act appear in the public space, in work, only the work appears in the public space, not the actor. They hold themselves back. This becomes very important in her reading, because when we meet on the market of exchange in the public sphere as workers or artists, what is met and interacts in the public, in the marketplace, are not human beings, but their products, what they've produced. So on page 209, at the beginning of the last paragraph at the bottom, she says, however, the people who meet on the exchange market are primarily not persons, but producers of products. And what they show there is never themselves, not even their skills and qualities, as in conspicuous production of the Middle Ages, when you were a trade union or a guild member and you produced something that was very much yourself. But what the impulse that drives the fabricator, the artist, the maker, to the public market is the desire for products, other people's products or one's own products. And so what she says is that in showing products but not ourselves, the exchange market dehumanizes and alienates the human actor from the public realm, right? On the next page, she says, it is this lack of relatedness, this is the very top of the next page, to others, and this primary concern with exchangeable commodities which Marx denounced as the dehumanization and self-alienation of commercial society. Now, the obvious solution to this, or response to this, is, well, what about works of genius? What about works of art in which the work is not just some, mass-produced good, but in a sense represents something new and unique about the creator? When that happens, and when you put a work of genius into the market, isn't there a way that this exchange market creates a public space of newness and uniqueness? And she has these paragraphs on genius from 210 to 211. And the argument that she's making is that A, the modern age resents the idea of genius more than any other, for a number of reasons, one of which is simply the corruption of the idea of genius. But the more important reason, and the reason that matters to us, is that we so revere genius, so idealize or make it into an idol, that when we put a work of art into the public, it appears objectively, right? And it manifests, this is on 211, the top, it manifests the identity of a person and therefore serves to identify authorship, but it remains mute itself and escapes us if we try to interpret it as the mirror of a living person. This is part of her argument, actually very much following Marx, about alienation. In other words, the idolization of genius harbors the same degradation of the human person as the other tenets prevalent in commercial society. We focus on the work, the object, and not on the persons, the individuals behind them. And we lose sight of, in looking just at the work, we lose sight of the actor, and thus and what we end up losing, of course, is freedom, natality, the idea of creating something new in the exchange market. The second reduction of the public space of public appearance is in labor and in the laboring society, which is a much more complete reduction of the space of common appearance than in work. Because in labor, we are reduced to simply our bodily needs, which don't distinguish us from others, but since we all have the same basic bodily needs, unite us with others. And that's the first part. And the second part is that, and this goes into the next chapter, in laboring and and laboring in a factory and laboring in a consumer society, we become part of a mass consumer culture and mass taste and lose our individuality. And so the public world of labor loses its ability to be a public space where plural, unique, and different acting people enter the public world. Let me just talk briefly about the end of the labor chapter, which is on the labor movement, which I think is somewhat fascinating. As I said, both Homo faber and Animal laborans are two ways of acting in public that do not engage the public space and thus do not act. But Arendt, who's married, by the way, to Heinrich Blücher, who's a former labor activist and Spartacist leader, makes the important point that there's probably been no more important political active group in the 20th century than labor, European working class, which she calls on 215 the most glorious and probably most promising chapter of recent history. So what she does then is she divides the labor movement into two. And she says that there's the trade unionist movement, which is the part of the labor movement that wants better wages, health care, work regulations, etc. And then there's the political labor movement, right? And what she says is that the trade unions were never revolutionary. She says that's verbatim on page 216, right? 5 lines in. The trade unions were never revolutionary in the sense that they desired a transformation of society together with a transformation of the political institutions in which the society was represented. It basically worked to bring the labor workers, the laborers, into existing political and social arrangements. But there was a political side of the labor movement which has always wanted not just better wages, but wanted the workers to run things. And the political side of the labor movement is found in things like workers' councils and certain parts of the anarchist movement in Spain, radical educational philosophies. But basically, it's part of the movement to say that not only should the workers be paid more, but the workers should govern. And you know, she'll say on page 217, about 5 lines down again, the political labor movement has been defeated each time it dared to put forth its demands, as distinguished from party programs and economic reforms. So the economic labor movement has had largely success, right? It's, of course, the last 50 years have seen the end of that. But she's writing this in 1958 or 57, 58, which, you know, is that, especially in Germany, is the height of the success of the trade union movement. And even in the United States, it's fairly successful here. The point is that the trade union movement has succeeded in bringing emancipated laborers into society and into politics. It never succeeds in actually changing politics from a government of the elite over the laborers into a government by the laborers and by the workers, which she calls the radical and most interesting part of the labor movement. And so I want to we'll end by looking at a couple of sentences on page 219. She writes at the top of 219, or it begins at the bottom of 218. The enormous power potential these movements acquired in a relatively short time, the labor movements, and often under adverse circumstances, sprang from the fact that despite all the talk and theory, they were the only group on the political scene which not only defended its economic interests, but fought for a full-fledged political battle. So the labor movement actually fought for its interests. It said, give us more money, give us regulations, give us time, and give us power. In other words, when the labor movement appeared on the public scene, It was the only organization in which men acted and spoke qua men. Here's that qua men again. As actors, as people who were not simply members of a society, but were excluded from a society and wanted to change that society or to get into that society. And thus they weren't acting predictably. They were often making extreme demands. For this political and revolutionary role of the labor movement, the political role, right, which in all probability is nearing its end, it is decisive that the economic activities of its members was incidental. They weren't talking about making more money or health care. They were talking about something else. And here's the key point, and that its force of attraction was never restricted to the ranks of the working class. Intellectuals also were attracted to the working movement. Why? If for a time it almost looked as if the movement would succeed in founding a new public space with new political standards, the spring of these attempts was not labor, not laboring, but those injustices and hypocrisies which have disappeared with the transformation of a class society into mass society. What drove the political labor movement, as well as the intellectuals who joined with it, was not economic thinking, but injustices. There were the elite, the aristocracy, and there was everyone else. And she's saying the reason the labor movement was powerful is because of those injustices. The reason it's dying out is to a large degree because workers succeeded in making themselves like everyone else. Now everybody's a worker. There are no people left in society in 1958, as she's writing this, she's saying, who are outside of being called workers or laborers. They all have to work. Now, I think there's a good argument that some people are making that we're creating a new, what's called a precariat class, people who don't have wages and income guaranteed or health care guaranteed, which was the success of the trade union. The trade union movement succeeded in getting most workers basic, economic security. We're now at a point where that's being unwound on the bottom, and on the top where you're creating a new hereditary upper class. So she didn't, I think she would, I don't know what she would say today, but her claim here is relevant to the 50s through the 80s or 90s, I think, in how she's writing. In any case, that's how she ends this, with this idea that the political labor movement was ending because the workers largely became equal political citizens. With corruption of the political process today, that may be over. And that's why I think there's an opportunity for a new political movement, whether it's called a labor movement or not. There is certainly an opportunity for that today. We're out of time. Thank you all. And we will meet next month. I look forward to it. I'm going to try and finish the action section for next month, and then we'll move on after that. Thank you all very much. I'll see you next week.